Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Greetings, welcome everyone. We are in session 4 of our course, What History Class Left Out Part 2, African World History from 711 to 1896 CE. We're coming to you as always from BIA Media, that's 235 Montreal Road if you ever want to join us in person, or you can continue to join us online via Zoom. Either way, we're continuing our movement through African world history. Black History Month ended. We're now in March, and March is Black Future Month. Black Future Month. So in Black History Month, we do what Dr. Woodson asked us to do: to reflect and to engage in what he called dispassionate appraisal of the contributions of African people to world history. So when we look at that, that's essentially practicing Sankofa. That's asking us to dispassionately, so we look at the good, the bad, and everything in between of African world history, so we can figure out how to move forward in a more just manner. So as we go about doing that, Black Future Month wants to take that dispassionate appraisal, review it, and then figure out, how do we move forward? How do we consciously plan to build institutions to move forward to get us to where it is that we want to be? So Black History Month, we reflect. Black Future Month, we actively plan. We actively and consciously decide what our destiny will be as African people. And we get together in community and we, think about where we're at locally, what we want to do in our local areas. Then we think about what we want to do, nationally, and then ultimately internationally as African world people. So that's Black Future Month. That's what we are engaged in March. So our discussions for the second portion of our seminar, which will end at the end of March, we're going to be looking at this history of this time period with that in mind, with that idea of using this history and thinking about how we can take these lessons and push us forward in the future. I mean, that's what we do every week. That's what we do all the time, is connecting the history to the present and the future. But we are explicitly doing that in March, thinking about how we can take these lessons and push us forward. And today's conversation is a great case study in how to do this, because we're going to be talking about political institutions. Again, we're going to be talking about large kingdoms and empires that existed throughout Africa. And we're going to look at a particular institution that we find across the continent and even makes its way into the diaspora, into the Americas. And that's the institution of the Queen Mother, which goes by various names in various places all throughout the continent and again into the diaspora. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how the title of Queen Mother was wielded by African women in this period. And today we're going to go largely chronologically from where we left off, the 15th century we'll probably go into the 18th century, 15th into the 18th century, maybe the end of the 18th century. So the 1400s into the 1700s, up to the end of the 1700s. Very important time period for Africa, particularly West and Central Africa. This is the time period where the slave trade emerges, the Atlantic slave trade. So we're going to talk about that institutions or that period's impact on this institution of the Queen Mother. And today's discussion, again, will be a part of that dispassionate appraisal. Because when we look at this history, we're going to ask ourselves, what are the positives of what we're learning about today? And then what are the negatives? How do we build on the positives and try to avoid doing the negative elements of this time period in history? And Queen Mothers are a perfect institution to examine. Because on the one hand, we're going to say, wow, this is beautiful, that African people were able to have women in power and wield so much influence that women in other places in the world at this period in time didn't have. And they were able to control armies and control economies and run states. And they were looked up to for their wisdom and their knowledge and their political know-how. That's great. And that's something that we should definitely apply in 2024, because we look at the African continent today, we don't see the amount of women in leadership that we did back in the day. So that's a positive. The negative aspect we have to consider, we're talking about empires and kingdoms today. And as we've mentioned in numerous classes before, often empires are built on exploitation, various types of exploitation. So on the one hand, we applaud these sisters for their political acumen, their military skills, their economic organization. On the other hand, well, what was that talent used for? It was built off of exploiting working class people and even enslavement in some instances. So we're going to talk about both. And we're not going to shy away from either discussion, because we have to do the dispassionate appraisal to move forward in a more just fashion. So that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. We're going to start where we left off. So weeks 2 and 3, we talked about the great empires of what was called the Western Sudan. So the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And we talked about their great trading networks, their political organizations, some of the leaders. And we ended class talking about the fall of Songhai in the 1590s and what happened in this area. Well, when Songhai fell, one of the more important empires, again, that we're going to have an entire class on in April, of Kanem-Bornu, remained strong. It had been a strong kingdom that incorporates parts of what's now northern Nigeria, Niger, Chad, this entire region here. So Kanem-Bornu, the queen mother of Kanem-Bornu, was known as the Magaira. The Magaira. Magaira. That was the queen mother of Kanem-Bornu. The Kanuri political structure was very interesting because it allowed so much room for women to hold political power, significant political power. Going back, if you notice the strategic location of this empire, it was built around Lake Chad. Lake Chad was much bigger than it is today. Lake Chad has shrunk due to climate change. That's something we'll talk about probably in the next course. But anyway, the kingdom was built around Lake Chad, but you see where it's at in terms of the trade networks that existed in Africa. It was right at a center point between the trade that was going east to west across the savannah, as well as the trade that went north to south and south to north. So very strategic location. So the rulers of Kanem-Bornu were able to take advantage of that. They were able to tax trade. They were able to build a strong military with a cavalry. They were able to import firearms from their allies in the Ottoman Turks who existed in Europe. They were their allies. They were co-religious because at some point in Kanem-Bornu's time as an empire, the rulers became Muslim. The everyday people didn't become Muslim, but the rulers became Muslim. That allowed them to have these connections throughout the Sahara into Egypt, ultimately into Turkey, and have this connection with the Ottoman Turks. So they imported firearms. Very powerful kingdom, and women were central to its rise. So the way, and there was a system of checks and balances that should look very familiar to folks that study modern politics. You had the emperor or the Mai, who was the nominal head of the political system. But then there was also the Council of 12 that gave the emperor advice. These were noblemen that, met with the emperor and talked about various subjects. And then you had the Queen Mother, the Megaira, or Megira, Megira, I think it's Megira, the Queen Mother. I have her slightly higher than the emperor, and we have one historical example of this. Although the emperor is nominally in charge, like all of us on this line, you can't go against your mother. I mean, you could think you're in charge until you go to your mother's house and then she tells you to sit down. So the Queen Mother had that power. The Queen Mother had her own military. The Queen Mother had her own palace. The Queen Mother had her own economic power. And in one instance, we know for a fact that one of the Maids had committed an offense. So the emperor had killed a man that was found guilty of theft. Now, because at the time, the Kanuri Empire, the Kanem-Bornu, was a Muslim empire, they were supposed to be following Sharia law. And in Sharia law, you don't kill people that are accused of theft, you chop off a hand. But because he killed this man, the Queen Mother said, you actually broke the law. The emperor, you broke the law, so I'm putting you in jail. So she put him on a grown-up timeout. I have a 2-year-old, so these are things that are in my head right now. But the queen mother put him on timeout. She put him in jail. This is the power of the queen mother. So the queen mothers were also able to step in and actually run the country if the emperor died without an heir that was of age. And we see this most famously in the career of one of the more famous Ma's, Idris Aluma. Idris Aluma became one of the more powerful leaders in African world history as emperor of Kanem Bornu, but it didn't start out that way. His father died when he was young, when he was a child. So his mother actually ran the state and got him ready to take over. And even when he was of age, she still kind of ran things alongside him for the first 7 years of his reign. So you see how powerful this position was in Kanem Bornu. But not just the queen mother, you also had the king's first wife, the Gumsu, who had a tremendous amount of influence and power, as well as the king's sister, the Megara. And this is actually a holdover from the pre-Islamic days of the Kanem Bornu Empire, because prior to Islam, the emperor wasn't a descent, it wasn't a patrilineal descent, meaning the emperor was not related to the previous empire, father and son. That wasn't how it went. It went the same way that many kingdoms in Africa went before Islam, where you inherited the throne through your mother. So you had to be related to the royal family through your mother. So the previous emperor might have been your uncle, he may have been your brother, but you were all related through your mother. Your mother was the most important element in the situation. The father was not. So when the emperor died, it wasn't his son that took over. It was often his nephew or his brother or someone connected with him through the matrilineal line. But after Islam, it became father to son, father to son. But the king's sister still maintained that position of influence that she had prior to the coming of Islam. Because remember, prior to Islam, the king's sister was more than likely the next Megara was the next queen mother, because it was the king's sister who would have the child that would be the next in line. So that was carried over from the pre-Islamic days. And so that position maintained its influence and power. So this is Kanem Bornu. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Kanem Bornu because we're going to have an entire class on it. There's a ton of literature. They wrote their own histories. The Arabs talked about Kanem Bornu. Eventually, the Europeans who came in contact with Kanem Bornu will write about it. So we're going to have an entire course on that in April. But again, this map shows an even better example of what Africa looked like at this time. We're talking about the 1500s, 1600s, going into the 1700s. You see all of these trade routes, and Kanem Bornu was right in the middle of that. But then if we just go further to the east, or excuse me, to the west, the Hausa states, which is now in modern day Nigeria and a little bit of Niger, another powerful kingdom right along this trade route. And this is a very important region in Africa. You see where all these empires are lined up, all the way from Mali in the west to Ethiopia in the east. This is all along the Sahel, what the Arabs call it the Sahel, or the shore. What they call it the shore because the Sahara Ocean is almost like, Sahara Desert, excuse me, is almost like an ocean. And the Sahel is the shore. This is the grassland before you get to the forest area of Africa. So you can kind of divide it in three. You have the Sahara up top, you have the Sahel, and then you have the more dense forest regions, going into the Congo River Basin, but also in the equatorial parts of West Africa. So this middle area of grassland, this is where so much trade was happening. It was almost a highway, a network that connected these empires and trade, where you could get goods coming from West Africa to East Africa, going from throughout the Sahara, the camel caravans that were carrying salt from the north and gold from the south, and other items, eventually cola nuts. We'll get to that in a minute. So it was a highway, a network of inter-African trade that existed during this time period. And these empires were able to take advantage of that by taxing the trade and providing the goods that went from place to place. So just west of Kanem Bornu, you have the Hausa states. Again, very powerful queens at this point in time. None more powerful than Queen Amina. Queen Amina. Now, she wasn't the queen mother. She was just queen outright, female ruler outright. and one of the more powerful female rulers, one that commanded an army that was very much like the army of Sunni Ali Burr. She was rarely defeated. I just want to read a praise poem for Queen Amina the Great. And again, we're talking about the Hausa state, so that area you see in green to the west of Canon, Borno. She also went by the name of Queen Gumsu. And again, this is from Constant Hillier's Intellectual Traditions of Pre-Colonial Africa. So it said, Queen Gumsu, owner of Maradi town, never looks behind her. She has no reason to look behind her. She's not afraid. She never looked behind her. Owner of the city of Yam and the land of Yemen, and in Gassar, Gamu, and Njimi town. Your mortar is made of the scented Guinea pepperwood. You own a pestle of polished silver. Gumsu Amina, daughter of Taba, descendant of the great and the blessed. Good morning, good morning. You are like the moon at its full, like the morning star. Precious as gold, daughter of a bush cow. You are a bush cow among women. That's not an insult. That's a powerful position. Gumsu, daughter of a lion. She is a lion as precious as gold among all women. Like silver, Amina, daughter of Taba, may Allah give you the long life of a frog and the dignity of an eagle. This is how powerful Queen Amina was. She was a uniter of the various folks in the Hausa states to create a strong empire. And she, again, built her empire off of conquering others and creating a strong base for economic development. But again, all of these empires are built off of conquering and warfare, which, like all empires throughout the rest of the world, this is how they're built. So Africa is building empires at this time. And there's a lot of inter-African trade, but by the time we get to the 1500s, a lot of that trade is going to start to be diverted to the western coast in the center and the coast of Central Africa. We're going to talk about that in a second. So if we go further west, so we go from Hausa land and we go all the way west to what's now the Senegal and Gambia, you have the position of the Linguère. The Linguère, this is the queen mother among the Wolof states. Again, another strong figure. She has her own military base. She has her influence in choosing the next rulers. And these are the states that existed. They have, originally were controlled by the Empire of Mali, but then they were able to break away. And there was at one point a very strong Wolof empire. And the Linguères were able to exert their influence throughout the region. This area would break into a number of kingdoms. And then ultimately, though, they would be some of the first Africans to come in contact with the Portuguese in the 1400s. It's these kingdoms that the Portuguese encounter as they're making their way down the coast of West Africa into Mauritania, into Senegal, and they begin kidnapping folks and to begin the process of the transatlantic slave trade. It's the Portuguese that start this off. We're going to talk about the Portuguese a lot over this week and next week. They're the first Europeans out. They heard of Mansa Musa, who we talked about 2 weeks ago. They've seen all the gold coming into Europe from Africa, from Songhai, from Mali, from Ghana earlier. They want to know what's the source of this gold. So that's why they're making their way down the coast at first. They're looking for gold. But then the Portuguese realized that they could grow sugar, and they start a booming sugar industry in the islands off of Africa, in the Azores, in the Western Mediterranean. And then they realize they need labor for these islands that they're growing the sugar on. And they start kidnapping Africans, starting in Mauritania, down into the Senegambia, and then they're going to eventually make their way into the Bight of Benin. But first, they're located right in this northwest region of Africa. You had some of the rulers in the Senegambia that fought against the Portuguese. That was actually the first instinct for most folks. When people started getting kidnapped on the coast, and the Portuguese would take them to Portugal and essentially make them forced translators. So the Portuguese would find people on the coast, kidnap them, take them to Portugal, and say, all right, you're going to learn Portuguese. That way we're going to bring you back so that you can negotiate with us, for us, with these African rulers on the coast. And they would also ransom people back. They would kidnap people. This is how they would make their introduction. Instead of coming into West Africa and saying, hey, we're the Portuguese, we have these goods, can we engage in some trade, that will be mutually beneficial to both parties? No, they introduced themselves by kidnapping people and then ransoming them back to their rulers. News got out. And in Senegal in 1447, there was a battle of the Ombos River. The Portuguese made their way. The Africans knew that they were coming. They engaged in the battle, and the Portuguese were routed by the African Navy. But they eventually come back. And when they come back, they start engaging more and more with the rulers in the Senegambia. And at one point, some of these rulers decided, let's do business with the Portuguese. We want the things that they have, and we start to see the beginnings of this horrible and horrendous African slave trade or European initiated slave trade going to the West. Because eventually, as the 1400s go into the 1500s, when Columbus gets to the Americas, starts exploiting the indigenous population, realizes that they're dying from diseases relatively quick, they can escape, they can resist, then they take the cue from the Portuguese, who had already been enslaving West Africans, taking them to islands in the Mediterranean, taking them back to Portugal, but eventually that trade gets diverted to the Americas. The justification being these Africans, number one, they're not Christian. And it's okay to enslave non-Christians. The original justification was they're Moors, they're Muslim, and then Europe had, come out of the Crusades. So to be Muslim mean to be an enemy, to be an infidel. So you can be enslaved. Then it went from religion to race. And then a whole philosophy of anti-Black racism begins to emerge at this time that we'll get into later on. But this is how it starts. But again, at this moment with these Wolof states, the Linguères, very powerful women that are either resisting the Portuguese and resisting the slave trade, and then some are enabling it. Because women don't have a natural, inclination to like a more natural inclination to justice than men. We're people. You got selfish men and you got selfish women. You got righteous men and you got righteous women. So when we talk about these queens and queen mothers, they're just like men. They're going to do what's in their best interest. And we're going to see some examples of that moving forward. But the important thing that I want to point out again, I'm going to keep going back to this. Throughout this region, you have women with significant political power that are making these decisions. Whether they're good decisions or bad decisions for their people, they're making these decisions. And in 2024, we don't have enough women throughout the African world making these top-level political positions because we've adopted a European idea of who should be in charge. In fact, the history that I'm talking about today, and I forgot to do our evidence slide, is coming to us from Arab sources, African oral sources, and European sources. And oftentimes, we have to really investigate those sources deep to see the presence of these women. Because for the Arabs and the Europeans, they're almost afterthoughts, or they're looked at as, these exotic figures of, wow, these Africans are really backwards. They have women in charge. That's a backwards way of thinking, according to the Europeans and according to the Arabs. So either they're recorded as aberrations or something that shows how exotic Africans are, or they're not recorded at all. And we have to go into the oral history, or when Africans are writing their own history, rather writing in Arabic or writing in European languages, that we start to see how powerful these women are and what their stations actually represented to the people. So you have to really engage the text with that critical eye, looking for these women and their positions, because the Arabs and the Europeans, they don't dwell on these women. They'll skip over them in the historical narrative. So something to keep in mind. So we're going to move further south. So we started in the middle. We went from Kanem Bornu. We see the Magira and Kanem Bornu. Then we go to the Hausa state. We talked about Queen Amina. We went west to the Linguères or the Wolof states. Now we're going to go to what's now modern day Ghana, to the Ashanti Empire, the Ashanti Confederacy. This is the current Queen Mother among the Ashanti. So these positions in a lot of places in Africa are still around. So we know about the kings in England. They're always in the news, whether we're talking about Charles is cancer, and I'm supposed to boo-hoo for him. Actually, it is kind of messed up, though. He waited this long to become king, now he got cancer. But anyway, I'm not laughing at that, but I kind of am. And we knew his mother, and they were always in the news, but how many African people don't know about African royalty? And I'm no fan necessarily of the structure of kings and queens. I think they're exploitative political structures, but I do appreciate tradition. And it's important for us to know these traditions. So there actually is a sitting queen mother in Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti Empire, and they exist. And you can see the gold, and you can see the majesty. You see the people that are holding her up as she makes her way through the crowd. And she is the sister of the current Asante Hene, or the current king of the Ashanti. This is his older sister. Among the Ashanti, the matrilineal succession still exists. So you don't become the Asante Hene, or the king of the Ashanti, the high chief of the Asante, the emperor, from your father. You have to be related to the royal family through your mother. So you're often replacing an uncle, you're replacing a brother, something like that. The Ashanti are part of a cultural group in this part of Africa called the Akan Cultural Group. So this includes a number of political units and nations and slightly different languages, but they're all commonly understood and commonly connected and put under the label Akan, A-K-A-N. Akan philosophy, Akan language dominates what's now Ghana and parts of Togo as well. So among the Akan, we have sayings such as this: let us seek counseling from the old lady. Because eldership is incredibly important throughout most of Africa. The older you get, the wiser you're supposed to be. And among the Akan, men and women are seen equally as knowledgeable, as wielders of power. There is a strong dualism in terms of gender among the Akan in Akan philosophy. Even your makeup as a person, you receive your soul and your spirit from your father, but your blood comes from your mother. And you need both of them to be a complete human being in a philosophical thought. In fact, the blood might be slightly more important, and we see that in terms of leadership. So very important. And so the older you get, the wiser you get, and older women throughout the Akan system were praised for their knowledge, their ability to guide in political matters, spiritual matters, economic matters, so on and so forth. It's the queen mother that has the highest position in Akan political setups in terms of as a woman. So you have the king or the chief, and then you have the queen mother, who is often not even necessarily his biological mother. Sometimes it is, but that's not always the case. It could be a sister, it could be an aunt, it could be a grandmother, even in some cases if she outlives her sons. So when we talk about the queen mother may nominate a candidate from among the members of the stool family. So among the Akan, the symbol of royalty is a stool. The ultimate symbol among the Ashanti Empire, which is, again, a part of the Akan cultural group, is the golden stool, which we'll talk about soon. And we'll have a longer discussion about the prominence of the golden stool when we talk about resistance to colonialism. But the stool is the symbol of power. It's like the throne in Europe, the stool. So the stool family, in consultation with the Jat Seheni, or the head of palace administration, and her relatives, but the nomination of a candidate remains her sole responsibility. Very important. It's the queen mother that chooses who will be the next Asante Hene. So the Asante Hene dies, there's a number of young men eligible to rise to that position. And they're all related to the queen mother matrilineally. So they could be her nephews, they could be her son, but she's the person responsible for making a decision out of all of these candidates. This is who I'm choosing. Very powerful, because she sets who's going to be the next emperor. And then when she passes away, it's the emperor's job to choose who will be the next Ohima or Asante Hima, or the queen mother. He chooses among his sisters, his aunts, those type of folks. And let's say if it was his grandmother that ruled, then he would probably choose his mother if she's still alive, or his aunt. So it's all about this balance of power between the Queen Mother and the Emperor. The Queen Mother had her own troops. She had her own economic power, her own palace. So very important figure. But this empire arises. The Grand Confederacy of the Ashanti arises at a very important time in African history, around 1670. And it takes the place of another Akan cultural group. So again, all these different kingdoms that I'm talking about, that's in modern day Ghana, they are all Akan speakers, with the exception maybe of the Ga. I'm not sure if the Ga, if that's in the Akan language. But anyway, the other major power in the region in the 1600s was a kingdom called Deshira. Deshira gets a bad rap because they lost the war. So the Ashanti are the ones that write the history. So according to the Ashanti, the Deshira were oppressive. They ruled the kingdom, they ruled this region, and the Ashanti were one of many groups that were underneath the Deshira kingdom. And Deshira overtaxed them. They had tyrannical rulers, and they had queen mothers as well. So this isn't something that is an Ashanti creation. This existed prior to the Ashanti. And in fact, before the Ashanti become an empire, on the local level, this is the setup. From the local level to the national level, you have an emperor and you have a queen mother on every level, down to the city, down to the village, down to the family head. You have a male head and a female head. You have to have both because, again, Akan personhood requires you to acknowledge both elements within you. The female providing the blood, the male providing the spirit. You need both elements. So eventually, a man by the name of Osei Tutu. Osei Tutu was a ruler among the Ashanti, and the Ashanti were, again, just a small kingdom that were under the control of the Deshira. Part of being under the control of Deshira, like many kingdoms that we've talked about, the rulers in Deshira would take the potential rulers of the smaller kingdoms that were under them and essentially hold them hostage in their capitals. And they would tutor them and they would show them the ways of ruling. So Osei Tutu was very familiar with how the Deshira kingdom operated. So he gets strong enough, he coalesces a group of other kingdoms that are tired of being ruled by the tyrannical Deshira kingdom, and he is able to overthrow Deshira and to set up the the Ashanti Confederacy. According to oral tradition, when he does this, a golden stool comes down from heaven, and it's with Osei Tutu as well as his essentially prime minister, who is also a priest and a war general. He's able to control the country, and that golden stool becomes the symbol of this new confederation. So you had a number of smaller kingdoms all ally themselves under the leadership of Osei Tutu to become the Ashanti Grand Confederacy. And his mother becomes the Asante Hima, the most powerful woman in this new confederation, in this new confederation that's going to turn into an empire. Because eventually that voluntary collaboration under the leadership of Osei Tutu, as his descendants become the Asante Hini, that becomes much more centralized. So it's not necessarily a voluntary confederacy anymore. It's truly an empire where the other smaller local kingdoms, they're paying tax to Kumasi, which is the capital, and the Asante Hini becomes much more powerful. And in addition, the Asante Hima, the queen mother, becomes exceptionally more powerful. Now, while all this is going on, while all of this is happening, all this state building is happening in Africa, and this war between Deshira and the upstart Ashanti is happening, one of the ways the Ashanti are getting more power to overthrow Deshira, as they're fighting this war, their captives are being sold to these new Europeans that are on the coast that have been there since the 1400s. Because the Portuguese, again, they're making their way down around the coast of Africa. It's the Portuguese that built Elmina Castle in Ghana. And they're followed later on by the Dutch and the Danish. Even the Danish were involved in the slave trade. And they built Christiansborg Castle. Then eventually all this is taken over by the British. But at this point in the game, we're talking about the 1500s going into the 1600s, it's the Portuguese and the Dutch that are dominating the trade on the coast of West Africa. And by the time we get to the 1500s, the Portuguese don't want anything else from Africa. except for enslaved labor, because they're trying to build Portugal. I mean, not Portugal, excuse me, Brazil. They control Brazil. So they need enslaved labor for Brazil. And the Portuguese are also supplying the enslaved labor for the Spanish that are in the Americas. We have to go back to 1492. The Spanish and the Portuguese are the first Western Europeans to make headway into the Americas in this modern period. We know the Vikings were there earlier, but in this modern period, it's the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, they don't want to fight amongst themselves, so they go to the Pope. And the Pope says, here's how we're going to divide the world. Spain, you get everything to the west of this line. Portugal, you get everything to the east of this line. That line was drawn through Brazil. So that's why when you look at the map today, the only country in the Americas that speaks Portuguese is Brazil. The rest were speaking Spanish before the English and the British and the Dutch and the other folks got involved in the Americas as well. But initially, the Pope said, I'm giving all this to Spain. So North America, Central America, South America, that's all Spain, with the exception of this part that sticks out. That's Brazil. We'll give that to the Portuguese. In Portugal, you get everything to the east. So you get Africa, you get in Indonesia, in India, you get control of all of that trade. That's what the Pope said. Now, the English and the French, they disregarded this later on. But that was the initial setup. So the Spanish didn't have presence in Africa. They relied on the Portuguese to get them enslaved labor from Mexico, for Colombia, for Venezuela, for Jamaica, because the Spanish controlled Jamaica at the time. Really important for our discussion. So when all this fighting is going on, the Ashanti Confederacy are selling captives to the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Danes on the coast of Ghana. And they're getting firearms in exchange for this and other things, and even using Portuguese mercenaries in their fighting. A lot of Africans use Portuguese mercenaries in their fighting. We'll talk about that moving forward when we go to Benin. So when Africans from this region go into the Americas, they are known as Coromantes. This is the name of the final town that they see as they're making their way to the coast. Because you have to imagine, these battles are happening further up in the interior of Ghana. And as the Ashanti are getting victory after victory, those captives are being marched to the coast. The last town that they've seen is Coromantes. So when they're embarked and they're put on those ships to go to Jamaica, to go to Brazil, to go to Mexico, to go to these places, they are known as Coromantes Negroes among the Europeans. The Europeans say, oh, we got them for Coromantes. When these Africans arrive in the Americas, many of them rebel. Because, again, they were fighting wars in Africa. So you think they're going to just stop fighting once they get enslaved? No, they continue to fight. The most famous example of this is Nanny of the Maroons. Now, notice her years. She was probably born sometime around 1685. This is at the height of the Deshira Ashanti battles for control over Ghana, or what's now modern-day Ghana. This is the height of the battle. So she was probably captured sometime around the rise of Osei Tutu. But again, the Deshira are a Khan cultural group, just like the Ashanti. So they have the same political setup. If you have a king, you have to have a queen mother. So in the situation of Jamaica, the Maroons of Jamaica, so many of these Akan folks were transported to Jamaica. At the time, Jamaica is going in between Spanish control and British control. The British and the Spanish are fighting to control Jamaica. So in the process of that fight, Africans are escaping enslavement in Jamaica and setting up these Maroon communities there. Yeah. We don't know for sure. That's circa, yeah, because we don't know for sure when she was born, and we don't really know for sure when she died. So that's what the C's for. Thank you for that clarification. So in the battle for Jamaica between Spain and Britain, Africans are using the opportunity to escape. It's not going to be the first time, won't be the last time that Africans use European competition to gain greater freedom. Once the British take Jamaica from the Spanish, now they have to deal with these Africans that have escaped enslavement, because again, they want to restart the sugar economy and the other goods that they're growing in Jamaica. And they see now that they have to deal with these huge populations of enslaved Africans that have set up their own communities. And they go to war, the Maroon Wars. And one of their fiercest competitors is the Queen Mother, Nanny of the Maroons. Now, for the Europeans, they're saying, why would these Africans follow this old woman? That doesn't make sense to Europeans. They wouldn't follow an old woman. Your ruler's supposed to be a king. But they didn't understand the Akan cultural context. They didn't understand African culture. So when they're negotiating and they see this old woman that has this disproportionate amount of power in their eyes, and they call her a witch and they call her a sorceress because she knew how to use traditional African religion and traditional African spiritual sciences to fortify her fighters. She knew guerrilla techniques to fight against the British, and she was able to lead her forces in battle as well as to control things politically to fight against the British. This is why she's a national hero in Jamaica, Nanny of the Maroons. But you won't understand why she's in this position and the position that she held if you don't understand what was happening in Africa. This is a cultural carryover. We see this throughout the rebellions that involve Coromantee folks in the Americas. So the way you know that they're Coromantees is because, again, among the Akan, there are certain day names. And you see these names repeated in the historical record. Names like Kofi and Cuffy and Kwamina and Amina and Kwao and Kojo or Kujo. You see these names repeated because there's only 7 days in the week, so you got 7 names, essentially. So these Coromantee Negroes, they would rebel in Jamaica. They would rebel in New York, again in Jamaica. And I always say it wrong. Somebody is going to correct me. Berbice and Guyana. So when they did this, when they were rebel and they were able to get their own free space, their own liberated territories, these are maroon communities, or if they tried to set up, if they tried to take over the entire nation like they did in Jamaica at one point, they tried to, and they were going to establish a Queen of Kingston. They always had a king and a queen mother, or a woman sitting in that position. Particularly in Kwamina's rebellion, actually in Amina's rebellion, and Guyana, the Dutch would write about this. And they say, yeah, Kofi, he's constantly consulting this woman that acts as his queen. And they couldn't really understand what was going on with that. But we understand because these folks are coming from a political tradition where this is the only way to actually have a functioning government. You have to have a king and you have to have a queen mother. So we see the carryover even into the Americas. So very important. We'll skip that. But again, I just want to talk about and give credit to Nana Kunandu Yiadom III. She's the current sitting queen mother in the Ashanti Empire. Very important figure. She's venerated. You know, she's very powerful, wealthy, and so on and so forth. I'm going to take a break. And we'll talk about, again, the same institution a little bit further to the east. We're going to jump right to the Republic of Benin, but not the Benin Kingdom. We're going to talk about the Kingdom of Dahomey, which, just like the Kingdom of Ashanti, also got rich off of the slave trade because their empire grew around the same time. So we'll take a break for a second. We'll open up for questions, and we'll also have comments. So, first question: who has their hand up, Daniel?
Mr. Francis and then Mr. Thomas.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. And as you said, Dr. Ledbetter, the word is Berbice, not Berbice.
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 I was trying to practice before I came today because I knew I was going to say it. And I was like, is it Berbice or Berbice?
Berbice.
East. Yes. Thank
Yes.
you, Mr. Francis. Thank you.
And I wanted to find out the Pope drew a line of demarcation in the world. And you had the Portuguese on the east side and the Spanish on the other side. I'm wondering what or who gave the Pope this authority to be able to divide the world in accordance with the wishes of the Europeans?
The Pope's understanding, it's a combination of both racialism, but actually at the time, it's not even so much racial superiority. It's slightly there, but that's not the main factor. The main factor is an idea of religious superiority. So for the Pope is the representation of Christ on earth. And the Great Commission is to spread Christianity throughout the world. So as this quote unquote new world was discovered, and you have this whole new area of quote unquote pagans, the Pope saw the Spanish and the Portuguese as Christian monarchs with the responsibility to dominate these places in order to bring the gospel and understanding of Catholic Christianity to these pagans. And the only way to do that was with strong monarchs that will use whatever, and they had the authority, the papal authority, and the Pope gets his authority from God, and from Jesus, to convert these people. And if they resist conversion, then to dominate these people until they convert or they're wiped out. That was the commission. So the Pope said, as good Catholics, this is your job. Convert these people, conquer these people, convert them. If they resist conversion, eliminate them. So the Pope said, the indigenous people, they don't have Jesus, you can do that to them. The African folks, many of them are Muslim or they're quote unquote pagans, so you could do that to them as well. So that's how the Pope had that idea, and that was the justification for that. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Treaty of Tordesillas, because he said, we don't want you fighting, you're good Christians, we don't want you fighting amongst each other. There's enough pagans for you to conquer for everybody, is essentially the warped understanding. It turns into racialism. It turns into racialism later on, but at this point in the game, religion is the primary cultural difference that they're locating on, that they're making these justifications about. They're not saying you can enslave Africans just because they're black. That's going to come as a result of this. The first thing is you can enslave these people because they are not Christian. They are pagan and that type of thing. The blackness is going to come in as this slave trade grows and becomes much more profitable.
On that basis, I hope we don't find aliens, because then they'd have another problem trying to convert them to Christianity.
Oh, I think if we find aliens, I think we'll probably be on the losing end of that. Because if they're able to get here, that means we're probably in trouble. Yeah, but we try to convert the aliens. That'd be an interesting conversation. Mr. Thomas, and then Robin, you have something? Robin, and then David H.
Morning, all. We talk about Black Futures Month. Today, we agree that our identity is in shambles. It is also true that most of what we strive for is short-lived. Example, Black Lives Matter. How then do we look forward without a state of being? Let's look at the LGBTQ as an example. They are moving from political to financial, and a steady growth, year in, year out.
Yes. Yeah. I think those types of conversations are what's needed in Black Future Month. I mean, we're supposed to assess in Black History Month how we got there, and then think about how we're going to move forward. So all those things you mentioned about identity and what areas we should be mobilized in and all those things, and looking at the movements that we have and where we want them to go, whether it's Black Lives Matter or anything else, and actively have those conversations in community about what should we do. And don't think that they're always going to be pleasant conversations and short conversations, but actual sitting down in rooms or sitting over virtual spaces and talking about these things so that we could try to figure out, okay, how do we move forward? So yeah, that's the type of work that we need to do, definitely. Robin, and then David H.
Well, and right on that note, I attended an event this week on it was Black entrepreneurship with a focus on the justice system, because the people that were on it were like in the justice system. The one guy was a judge, but he also had like a real estate thing, a company on the side, right? So it was kind of this interesting combination. Anyway, in the question period, I asked him, I said, hey, I'm going to bring together a group of Black people to examine the idea of starting a cannabis business where we will hire people who have had like previous cannabis convictions and then had them expunged, right? and market it as a black-owned cannabis business. What do you guys think of that? And they're like, great idea. Right, so that's going to happen, and we're gonna, in terms of bringing the people together, and that's addresses that. My question is, can you talk about Columbus's role in Jamaica?
Columbus's role in Jamaica. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I know his voyages throughout the Caribbean, he probably touched on Jamaica. I know his home base was the island of Hispaniola, so what's now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So I'm not sure all of Columbus's activities in Jamaica, but very soon after Columbus himself was there, the Spanish take control over Jamaica, and eventually, set up colonies. And then there's a battle amongst them and the British over who's going to control this island. Jamaica is really interesting because you have a lot of aspects of European piracy that are involved in Jamaica. It was parts of the island were used as pirate hangouts, as the English and the French and the Spanish are fighting amongst themselves. But yeah, Columbus is I'm not sure unless you want to go ahead.
Just a quick Google thing pops up. It says the discovery of Jamaica on May 5th, 1494. Was it 1492? He did landed in 1494. Christopher Columbus, the European explorer who sailed west to get to the East Indies, and came upon the region now called the West Indies, landed in Jamaica in 1594. And then I'll continue looking to see what else what he did when he got there.
Yeah, I mean, we know what he did in Hispaniola, and it's really perverse the way that these things are set up, because I don't want you to think that enslavement was some type of ad hoc experiment. This was a conscious effort among Europeans. They knew exactly who they were getting, because Columbus's and his descendants, when they're in the island of Hispaniola, when they're in the Caribbean, one of the main things they're looking for is gold. And they know from the Portuguese that Africans are experts in gold mining. So the importation of Africans from Ghana, which again, the Ashanti Empire didn't make all of its fortune based off of enslavement. That would be an incorrect statement. The Ashanti Empire's fortune was built on gold. This is one of the largest gold producers. It was called the Gold Coast. Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. It's one of the largest gold producing areas in the world. So the Ashanti Empire, the folks that lived there, knew how to mine gold. Much of the internal exploitation, so the exploitation within the Ashanti Empire, was based off of gold mining. So people that were captured in war, if they weren't sold to the Europeans, they were often forced to work in gold mines for the empire. Those were the people that the Europeans wanted. They wanted people with expertise in gold mining so that they could go to the Americas and mine gold. They also wanted people with expertise in clearing forest for agriculture. They were getting that from this region of Africa. The Empire of Ashanti is one of the forest kingdoms in this region of Africa. So we've moved from the Sahel further south into the great forest regions in Africa. It's here that Africans had to clear forests for agriculture. The Portuguese understood this. The Dutch understood this. So they said, as we're clearing Brazil and we're clearing the Caribbean for sugarcane cultivation and other agricultural products, we need people with that experience. So we want enslaved people from this region that are used to the tropical climate, that are used to working in those conditions, to clear the forest in order for agriculture. We need rice producers in the Americas. So we're going to get people from the Senegambia, from Guinea, that have been rice producers, and bring them to the Americas, to South Carolina, to North Carolina, in the rice producing areas. So where Africans went correlated to where they were from. If you grew rice in the Americas. That's where the Europeans knew exactly what they were doing and who they were getting. It wasn't just ad hoc. It wasn't just labor for just the sake of labor. It was, these people have expertise in this particular thing. We'll get them from these parts of Africa. So very important to point that out. David H., go ahead. And if you're talking, you're on mute. Yeah, we still can't hear you if you're speaking.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you for the talk. I was wondering if we zoom out from and look at this from a very high level, the language that we're continuing to use when doing History Month and African History Month. You know, I like this horse and I beat it every time. And our use of the word black, which was a label to define a very large population that had a darker complexion inaccurately. I saw in History Month a panel of ladies who came from different areas, and one happened to come from Nigeria, and she was introduced to the concept of being black. And because she didn't understand when people were calling her black, she said, well, no, I'm from Nigeria. And she started going on about her place of origin. And the people around her who were already assimilated to this culture were saying, no, 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 you got that twisted. You're black. Okay. Okay. And obviously that was a shock for her, but she assimilated. She said, oh, well, that's what they do here. And so that's the language they use. So I will identify myself as that from now on, which is absolutely ridiculous. So that's the horse I'm going to start with. Then I'm going to jump to race because, you know, this is the other one I like to beat on. And we all understand that there's only one race and that we're actually talking about cultures and different ways of living when we're talking about different people and from different areas. But if you say someone is racist, people understand what you're saying. But to say that someone is culturally intolerant, that's offensive. That you cannot be in our language today. So let's call it what it is, and maybe we'll get some more support because anyone can be culturally offensive and bigots. And if you call it what it is, it sounds nasty because it is. So let's stop beating around the bush, putting mislabels on things, and get to the root of the matter. Yeah, just a thought.
No, thank you for this, and understand that. So let me go. Some of you may not understand what David H. was saying when he says beating the horse. We've been having these classes for a few years now, and David H. is one of the regular participants and great contributors to the class. So we always have this discussion about identity and the label of Black, African. We have these discussions, and they're important discussions to have, particularly in this month, because we're thinking about how we move forward. What do we want to leave behind? Maybe we want to move out of that Black label, that understanding. That's a conversation to have. And we've had it in this class a number of times, and it's good. But I'm saying this for people that you may have never heard this yet. And I'm always encouraging folks, when we have this class, this is your class. So when we have our Q&As and our discussions, this is the opportunity to not only engage in this material, but to bring your own perspective and your own things. And all opinions and ideas are welcome. As long as, you know, you're not insulting anybody, anything like that, which is not, of course, what David H. did or anyone else does in here. So all ideas are open. Put them on the table. Let's discuss. That's what this is for. We'll really do that in the second part of the class. We have more time and we can really get into things, but that's what we do in here. So I welcome everyone because some of you might not know the history of this discussion we've had. We've had it for a while, and it's always fulfilling and it's always engaging. So bring that with you. Don't think that you have to be a passive participant in what we do here. This is why we open it up. If people can bring announcements, conversations, critiques, let me know where I went wrong and what we need to consider as a collective. So this is always a space for this. So I thank David H. for that. Robin, real quick, then we got to jump back in it.
Yeah, I've been around for a long too. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what Dave was saying, and it's consistent with what he has been saying. So, because I mean, and I agree with the terms being problematic, right? I run a group called the 61389 Black. However, I understand Black's a problematic term, but are you saying we should start like accusing people of cultural intolerance instead of systemic anti-Black racism? Is that the idea?
Okay, so even with systemic anti-Black racism, why are we taking the negative term? Because everyone associates negative things with anti. It is known. That's why when they wanted to make abortions more palatable, they called it pro-life or pro-choice. That they understood there was the anti-abortionist, which was the negative side by the name and association of the word, and then you went pro-life or pro-choice. We understand these little gimmicks that are being used in our society today. They're everywhere. That's why they call it systemic. So why are we buying into them? Like, we're aware of this. Why would you call it anti-black racism? I'm like, this, the name just makes my head go on fire, because there's, what's the positive in that sentence, or that framing, or that framing of words in that framework? Like, how can you make that a positive movement? Like, let's call it something like, I don't know, off the cuff, pro-cultural tolerance. Like, all of a sudden it sounds lighter, it sounds softer, it doesn't sound so angry. And I know that there's an anger behind it, but let's understand the gimmicks and the systems that we're playing in, and just level up a little bit, just a little bit, because I don't know. I'm seeing this, I see it as self-evident, but I've been around learning from Dr. Ledbetter for a minute, so he's teaching me much. So I thank you for that.
And again, these are conversations that I love having. And the unfortunate part of our existence is we only have a finite amount of time to discuss. So when we have these big philosophical discussions, we're going to have a lot more time to talk about that toward the second part of class. But we also need to make sure we create space to really have these discussions in community outside of just this class, so we can really get into these things, because these are the types of back and forth that create the synthesis that'll move us forward. One position, another position is presented, we talk about it, we discuss, we're not afraid to discuss, and then we try to collectively come to where we can get to. We might not always be able to accomplish that, but we make the attempt. That's what Future Month is about. All right, so let's get back into it. And we're using this past to help us elucidate these things. All right, moving further east. So we talked about the Ohima, the Asante Hima, the Queen Mother, and Ashanti. If we go just a little bit to the east, you get this one trips me up too. The Kapo Jito. This is the Queen Mother of the Kingdom of Dahomey. The Kingdom of Dahomey is in the modern state of the Republic of Benin, but is not to be confused with the Kingdom of Benin, which we will talk about in a second. It's a little bit further to the east, and they have their own Queen Mother tradition. But this is the Kingdom of Dahomey. The Wives of the Leopard by Edna G. Bay. This is a book that you can pick up that talks about the power of royal women in the Kingdom of Dahomey, including the Queen Mothers and such. Very powerful Queen Mothers, very similar to what we see among the Asante, very similar to what we saw in Senegal, in the Hausa states, in Camden Bornu. They control their own militaries, they're kingmakers, they are, economic powerhouses in and of themselves. This position began in the early 17th century, so the 1600s. And just like what we saw with Ashanti, this is the same time period that the Portuguese are making their way throughout West Africa. And of course, they come across the Kingdom of Dahomey, trade is engaged, and as Dahomey is expanding, it's unfortunate that this is all happening, while the slave trade is in full bloom. Because you had the same type of empire building throughout the world at this time, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. I mean, prior to Columbus's arrival and Cortez's arrival in Mexico, you had empire building in Central America among the Mexica, who the Spanish called the Aztecs. And they're building an empire, and it's built off exploitation. It's like these African empires are built off exploitation. But the key element is their empires in Europe, in Asia, and in the Americas before the arrival of Columbus, they're able to build and create these larger and larger political movements without outsiders interfering. When I say outsiders, outsiders from, across the waters. Not the same in this area of Africa. So as Ashanti is rising, as the Kingdom of Dahomey is rising, the Europeans are right on the coast saying, hey, as you're engaging in this nation building process and expanding and taking over territory, why don't you go ahead and sell us those captives? We'll take them off your hands for you. That way you'll get rid of some of your enemies and you'll make money. You'll get firearms that you can use as you expand more. And the more firearms that we give you, the more you can expand, the more captives that we need. Because this is the 1700s. This is going into the 1600s, 1700s. So now enslavement has really boomed in the Americas. Sugar production, cotton, rice, gold, silver. The Americans are being hyper exploited. The indigenous people are being pushed off. Africans are being brought in. The exploitation is at an all-time high, and the need for labor increases. So eventually, what starts out as the Europeans saying, we'll trade this at this point, except for enslaved labor. That's what the Europeans are after. That's what they want. And unfortunately, as this kingdom is emerging and is growing and is taking over this area, that legitimate trade that they're trying to create becomes more and more intertwined with what the Europeans want on the coast. And this is the pattern that we see throughout West Africa. If we go back to let me see, I want this map. As you can see, prior to the arrivals of the Europeans on the coast, most of this inter-African trade is going north and east to west. So even when we talk about Ghana or the Ashanti Confederacy, primarily they were trading from the south to the north. The Ashanti Confederacy that were trading cola nuts and gold up into the Mali Empire and the Empire of Songhai and trading with Kanem Bornu. In fact, the Ashanti Confederacy was really brought into these networks through the work of a group called the Jola or the Daula. Pronounced different ways, different places, but it's spelled D-Y-U-L-A. Sometimes it's spelled J-U-U-L-A. So the Jula, Daula, this is a group. They were professional traders. So they worked with the Mali Empire. They worked with the Empire of Songhai. And their task was to open up new trade routes and find new economic activity to drive this inter-African trade. So they were masters at long distance trade. They would go into the forest areas of Africa, meet with people and say, oh, you got cola nuts, you have gold? Well, we'll connect you with this larger trade route. We'll bring salt down here. We'll bring goods down here. We'll bring captives down here, because there were actually an internal African slave trade. But I want to caution us with this, and I want to be very, very clear about this. When Africans were enslaved inside of Africa, going from one place to another as a result of wars and different things, people were made captives, they were still considered human beings. Yes, it's exploitation of labor. Very much so. We're, again, positive and negative. We're not going to disregard that. We're talking about exploited labor. But the people were still considered human beings. And your condition of being enslaved was not necessarily passed down to your children. And you weren't property. You could get out of that position. If you worked in the mines and you showed you had an intellect and you showed you had potential, you could move up in society and get rid of that position of enslavement by joining the military, being courageous or whatever. You could prove yourself and through your merit, get out of that condition. Now, it might still be remembered that you were a captive and there might be still some stigma associated with that and with you and your descendants, but you were still considered a human being. You might be second-class citizen. And again, we can't excuse any of these things. That's still exploitation. That's still not right. That's not just. However, it's nothing compared to what's happening across in the Americas. You cannot compare enslavement in Africa to enslavement in America. It's two totally different things. Enslavement in America, your chattel, your property. Anything can be done to you. You had rights as an enslaved person in Africa, a captive. You had rights. You were a human being. You can only be treated a certain way. So that's very important. But anyway, the Jola are the folks that are involved in setting up these trade networks. But when the European comes along the coast, these networks start to break down. And the trade increasingly becomes more these African states with the Europeans. Less inter-African trade, more African states not trading with each other, but trading with the Europeans. This is going to have a disastrous effect on this region, particularly by the time we get to the 19th century, when the Europeans make the decision to say, hey, instead of taking African labor out of Africa to exploit, why don't we exploit African labor in Africa and then take the resources from Africa itself? That's called colonization. Slavery and colonization are directly related to each other. One goes right into the other. So it's a very important thing for us to understand. So the kingdom of Dahomey, again, the Queen Mother, incredibly powerful. She had the kingdom itself had an all-female force called the Minon. 2 years ago, a movie came out called The Woman King. This is the kingdom that they are discussing, where you had this elite fighting force of African women that defended this kingdom and helped expand this kingdom. So as the kingdom of Dahomey is expanding, the shock troops, the most elite troops in this kingdom, are its female fighters. And at the top of this entire pyramid is the Queen Mother, the Kapo Jito. The Kapo Jito was chosen among the previous king's common wives. So these weren't even royal women. So the king in Dahomey would have a lot of wives. Some of them he married for political alliances, and these were royal women, and then others were just commoners, regular, everyday women. When the original Capojito died, then the king would select among the previous king's widows, one of the commoners, to be the next Queen Mother. So he wasn't usually related to the Queen Mother. And she had her own power. And because of this position, if the king died, then the Capojito would look among, again, the possible heirs, and they would make alliances. The history of Dahomey, we know a lot about it during this period because the Portuguese are writing about what's going on here. We have a lot of records. And they talk about these palace intrigues where these wives who were potential Capojitos and these princes who were the potential kings would collaborate and use their power to try to figure out how we can work together so that it can benefit both of us. So I'll become king and you'll become the Queen Mother. And these were, again, not necessarily these men's mothers. They were other wives of his father. So he's trying to, they're all playing these games. It's almost like Game of Thrones if you watch that show. They're all trying to figure out how we can, leverage our economic and military power and even spiritual power. Because one of the things you see, one of the most powerful Queen Mothers in Dahomey was a woman named Hawangile, who lived between 740 and 774. Hawangile was one of these common wives. She was able to make an alliance with one of the princes, very powerful prince, and he became king, she became the Queen Mother. She used her position and her knowledge of African spirituality to make the position of Queen Mother even more powerful. So she had a military force, she had economic power, but then she did something very, 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 very smart and very sly. The religion of the kingdom of Dahomey is Voodoo. And in Voodoo, there are thousands of different spiritual entities. And at various times in the people's history, some of those spiritual entities are more powerful than others. And some of them are regional, some of them are national, some of them are connected to the royal family. They're ancestors of actual people that become deities after their death. So there's thousands of these figures. They're called the Loa in Haitian Voodoo. And I think they're called Loa in Dahomey as well. But what Hawangile was able to do, she took the two gods for her home region, Mawu and Lisa, these twin gods, and she elevated these twin gods to be the supreme deities in Dahomean Voodoo. Mawu and Lisa, one male, one female, represent the supreme gods in the pantheon of Haitian Voodoo. And it's because of her that this happened. By her doing this, she creates a situation where her region, and particularly herself, her personality becomes one of the more powerful figures in the kingdom. So she uses spiritual power combined with military power to make the position of the Queen Mother one of the most powerful figures in West Africa at this particular time. And it would continue after her death. So the Queen Mother in Dahomey always had this position of being almost like a high priestess as well. Very important. And again, this carries over into the Americas. So these wars of Dahomey expansion result in a number of folks going into enslavement in Haiti, in the Caribbean, and they bring the voodoo with them. And they're fighters, particularly the Menon, this all-female fighting force. One of the early leaders in the Haitian Revolution was a woman from this region that trained Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the first independent leader of Haiti. Very important figure, Victoria Montu. Victoria Montu, very important figure, coming from this region, trained one of the great leaders, and she was a fighter herself. And I think we talked about her when we talked about our class in the Haitian Revolution. We'll move a little bit further to the east, and then we'll close up for the day. The Iya-Yoba. The Iya-Yoba. This is the queen mother of the Kingdom of Benin. So not to be confused with the modern Republic of Benin. This is in Nigeria, the Iya-Yoba. This is the queen mother. She was the queen mother of the Kingdom of Benin as it expanded. And just like the other two that we talked about, this is also during the time period of enslavement. It was the first powerful Iya-Yoba, Idia, who helped her son Esege secure the throne in 1504. And this was actually done with the help of the Portuguese, actually. And there's some speculation as to whether or not Esege converted to Christianity. It's possible that he did in order to create his alliance with the Portuguese. But what we do know for a fact is he used Portuguese mercenaries, and his mother helped with this effort to secure the throne for him in 1504. The Benin Kingdom was so powerful and so rich as it grew that they were able to support artisans that created these beautiful pieces that often represented the royal family. And the most famous piece that actually came out of the Benin Kingdom, this pendant here, represents the Queen Mother. These are both representations of the Queen Mother. And the most famous is Idia, of course, the first Iya-Yoba. These pieces are scattered throughout the world, and they're slowly starting to be returned to Nigeria. The university, sorry, I was in the way. The museum at the University of Pennsylvania just announced last year, 2022, that they're going to start returning these pieces to Africa. In 1897, the British invaded Benin City and invaded the royal palaces, and they stole a lot of this artwork. And now it's all over the world. It's in museums in Germany, in Britain, in New York. And now there's been a movement to get these things back into Africa. But the important thing I wanted to point out is these casts, it's still really unclear how these artists, their exact technique for creating these masterful pieces of work. Daniel has talked about this when he talked about the Benin Kingdom last year. He's talked about the artistry. Now, often in this class, I focus a lot on the political and economic, because that's just my training. I'm trained as a political scientist, actually. But we should never overlook the cultural production that's happening during this time of empire building in West Africa and throughout the continent. As these empires grow, as we saw with Mali and Songhai, they're able to support a wide array of professions. People that would have normally been occupied with farming or hunting or this, that, and the third, now you have a diversification of the economy. You have people that are master craftsmen and craftswomen, artists. You have scholars. You have oral historians that are all supported by the state, either locally or on a national level. And they're creating these marvelous works of art that have spiritual elements as well as political elements to show the power and prestige of the royal family and of key figures in the military and others. You got images such as this. And again, these are all images of the Iyoba, the Queen Mother. This is the Queen Mother here with her own military forces at the ready. The Queen Mother is in the middle. You see her retinue of folks surrounding her, ready to go to battle. This is a representation of the military power of the Queen Mother of the Benin Kingdom. This is another one of those pieces that I think is on its way back to Nigeria. This was in, I want to say the Met in New York, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So there's a lot of African art that still needs to go back to the continent. The last thing I'm going to end up with, if we go all the way to the other side of the continent, to the Kingdom of Buganda and the Great Lakes region of East Africa. Again, The Queen Mother is present there, the Namasole, in the Kingdom of Buganda. Just like these kingdoms in West Africa, the Kingdom of Buganda was also influenced by international trade, this time not necessarily in the form of enslaved labor. The Portuguese eventually make their way all the way across to the eastern coast of Africa, and they disrupt the trade that was dominated by the Swahili city-states in East Africa, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in that process, and even before the Portuguese come, trade goods from Asia, from the Middle East, have been making their way into East Africa. And one of the most important trade goods that makes its way to the Kingdom of Buganda is one that you wouldn't think an empire could be built off of, but it actually was. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind playing that video of the origins of the Kingdom of Buganda in what's now modern-day Uganda. This is where the name Uganda comes from.
Identity. But on the other side of the country, on the banks of Lake Victoria, another kingdom had begun to flourish, thanks to a crop that would not just change the future of this region, but of the whole of the African continent. The Kingdom of Buganda began as small groups of clans who cultivated land by Lake Victoria. Their metamorphosis from a handful of communities to a powerful kingdom was thanks in part to a humble food crop, the banana. The high rainfall and fertile land of Lake Victoria's northern shores had encouraged the clans of Buganda to settle here in the first place around the 15th century. By the 1600s, a cohesive state had emerged, the result of organized cultivation of its most important crop. Bonyura had its salt, but the bananas of Buganda would create a kingdom that would challenge Bonyura's dominance once and for all.
So we're going this way?
We're going this way. So these are the banana trees. Ah, bananas at last, Sempek. I was beginning to worry that we'd missed the season, because this is obviously that most of them in harvest already. The clans of Buganda grew bananas in the fields and caught fish in the lake. It's a nutritious diet and one which helped their population to grow. There are over 50 varieties of banana grown in Uganda, but this one, the plantain or the matoke, is the most important. For the people who live here, the banana is both meat and drink. How wonderful. So the whole tree has to come down to harvest the banana. You get a sense of how important these are, that they're not just crops to be eaten. For the Buganda people of the 17th and 18th centuries, the banana was revolutionary. It not only fed them, but its leaves thatched their houses, its fibrous stalks were used to make cord, and its stems were used to build their defences.
Lirina omugaso munene nnyo kwegamba mu bulamu bwaffe nga ffe Abaganda. Gamba lituwa amaanyi ffe, oba lituwa amaanyi, lituwoomera nnyo nnyo nnyo, mmere tuwoomera nnyo eno.
The banana and its related products quickly became commodities, which the clans of Buganda traded in a regional economy, just as Bonyura had done with salt.
All right, Daniel, good stuff.
And it's
All right, so again, the result of Africa's connection to international trade, because bananas aren't from Africa, they're actually from Malaysia. So it's through these trade networks that originally Africans controlled in the eastern part of this from the Swahili city-states, brought this crop in, which allowed for the Kingdom of Buganda to grow and the clans to come together to create this empire. And one of the things that was key to this empire was the Namasole, the Queen Mother, who oversaw a lot of this. The Queen Mother. She was one of 3 persons who could bear the title of Kabaka or king, the others being the king himself and the queen's sister. So 2 out of the 3 people that could be called king are the king's sister and the king's mother. Very important. Again, another matrilineal situation here in Africa. And on the other side, so we've talked about Central Africa, North Central Africa, we talked about Canada, Bornu, over to the Hausa states, into the Wolof states, and at the extreme end of West Africa, down around again into the Kingdom of Ashanti, into the Republic of Dahomey, the Kingdom of Benin, and then all the way over in East Africa. You have the Namasole, the Queen Mother, this important political position for women, and then the Queen's sister as well. One story I just want to end you with to show you the power of the Namasole in the 1700s in Uganda. When he was king, Junju killed one of Samin Kukiro's wives, who was pregnant. Now, Tenza, the Queen Mother, was so angry with Junjun for this fraternal betrayal that she encouraged her other son to rebel against his brother. According to the traditions, she did this by sending her son 70 fighting men with the following challenge: if you are a woman, get married to these men. So she was so disgusted by one of her sons that she empowered the other to go fight against them. These women held their palace was on another side of the city from her son's palace. They had their own troops. They had their own economic power, the same setup that we see in West Africa. And they were able to be a check on tyranny. Sometimes they were the people involved in the tyranny. Again, women don't have an exclusive control over justice. Women can be just as tyrannical as men. So we see this, but the important thing that I'm bringing up, and as we close the class today, the reason why we've gone through these various cases of queen mothers is these are the aspects of African history that we need to take with us as we move forward. There's no excuse that we have 55 countries in Africa today and only 2 female heads of state. It should at least be 50-50. There's no excuse that Rwanda is the only country in Africa, it might be one other, it might be Namibia now too, that has over 50% representation of women in parliament. Our history shows us that women are strong political leaders when given the opportunity to be, strong economic leaders when given the opportunity to be. We are handicapping ourselves as a people to not encourage and create the space for women to control things politically, economically, socially, what have you. Now, I can tell you from my observations as someone that goes into high schools, that teaches university, that this new generation of African youth, particularly, I can say at least in the North American context, I don't have first-hand knowledge of what's going on the continent, but at least in the North American context, the sisters are taking that political power back. I go into these meetings, and I went to a lot this past February for Black History Month, into these high schools and middle schools, and they all have these Black excellence groups. And you know who's running these groups? The young sisters. In my classes, at the university level, the students that are doing the best, that are the most vocal, that are running the organizations and clubs on college campuses, it's the sisters. So when I teach this class in another 5 years, this might not be the case. Hopefully it's not the case. But I don't want it to be the overcorrection that I'm seeing among the young people now. Among young people, I have to talk to the brothers and say, hey, you all need to step up. Your sisters are doing great, and they're achieving, and I love that they're achieving. But you need to step up. You don't need to be so cool that you can't come to a meeting, that you would rather lean into the stereotypes applied to Black men that don't concern yourself with academics, don't concern yourself with that organizing, just play ball or rap and do those things. We're falling into that trap too. So we need to have the balance that you see displayed here with our ancestors. You had a king, you had a queen mother. You had a king, you had a queen sister. You had this balance. And even in the communities that we did not discuss today, among the Igbo of Nigeria, among the Balanta, among the Oromo, among different groups that weren't hierarchical, that didn't have kingdoms, you had men's councils and women's councils, where you still had this dual presence of the genders, who ran the societies in tandem and did what was best for their people with different perspectives being involved. Now, I don't want to paint the picture that Africa was some panacea of gender relations because every place wasn't like that. And of course, you do have patriarchal tendencies within certain African nations. That happened. Of course, we're not going to take the good and the bad, dispassionate appraisal. But it's important for us in 2024 to look back at these various examples so that we can move forward in a more just and sustainable way in 2024. So we're going to stop there today. Next week, we're going to talk about more examples of state development. We're going to talk about Central Africa, and we're also going to talk about the development of African states outside of Africa, because we started our discussion about enslavement today, but we're going to get more into what was actually going on in those free African communities that the Spanish called maroon communities, that in the Brazilian context, they're called quilombos. What was going on in those communities? So we'll talk about African nation building on the continent in Central Africa next week, as well as throughout the Americas when we talk about these independent African communities. So we'll stop there today. I'll open it up for questions, comments, or announcements that folks may have. We'll start.